Welcome to Day 37 on the Trail. We have 5 readings for today, from Luke 20 verse 27 through 21 verse 4, Exodus chapter 8 verse 1 through 9:12, Job chapter 11 verses 1 through 20, the 47th Psalm, and Sirach chapter 41 verse 15 through 42 verse 8. Today, we are going to cover the first 2 triads of plagues. In the first plague, the Nile was turned to blood. Now the Nile River was the lifeblood of Egypt, so turning it to blood would religiously and economically be devastating. Also, the first plague recalls the genocide committed when Pharaoh commanded that the male children born to the Hebrews be drowned in the Nile River. The second plague involves frogs swarming the land. However, the magicians of Egypt were able to reproduce the frogs as well. But this only aggravates the problem. The magicians could not remove the frogs, so Pharaoh has to ask Moses to plead for God for help. For the first time, Pharaoh hardens his heart after the plague passes. In the third plague, gnats rise from the dust across the land of Egypt. This time, the magicians cannot reproduce the gnats. Once again, when the plague is abated, Pharaoh hardens his heart for the second time. In the second triad of plagues, we begin with a plague involving flies. However, a distinction is now made between Israel living in Goshen and the Egyptians. Pharaoh initially allows Israel to leave, but changes his mind once the plague ends, and then Pharaoh hardens his heart for the third time. In the fifth plague, there is a pestilence on the livestock, but this applies to the Egyptians only, which causes economic ruin. The livestock of the Hebrews are not harmed, as God makes a distinction between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. Again, Pharaoh hardens his heart for now the fourth time. Then in the third plague of the second triad, God sends boils on the Egyptian population. Notice that the effect of the plagues on the Egyptian populace increases in its severity, as the boils are the first plague to affect humans directly. Again, Pharaoh hardens his heart, now for the fifth time. Now let's turn to the New Testament and Luke 20. Once again, Jesus uses direct, probing questions to reveal the true intentions of those challenging him. In the story told in verses 27 through 40, the real question being asked is not about marriage, but the reality of resurrection. This is one of the central debates between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and we will see this debate reoccur several times in Luke and Acts. Then Jesus adds to the discussion by quoting from Psalm 110, verse 1, which says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." You will notice that the first instance of the word Lord in Psalm 110, verse 1, is in small caps. As we discussed earlier on the trail, Lord, when printed in small caps, means that the name Yahweh is lying behind the word Lord, as it appears in the beginning of Psalm 110, verse 1. Therefore, we could read this verse as saying, Yahweh says to my Lord. Therefore, the one whom David calls Lord, without caps, cannot be David's son. Instead, the Messiah must be above David, and in such a position that David would call him Lord. Finally, a brief note regarding Luke 21, verses 1 through 4, which reads, "He looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, 'Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on.'" We see a widow placing 2 lepta into the treasury. Now a lepton was the equivalent of 1/128th of a denarius, which was a typical day's wage. A lepton was the smallest valued coin in use in Palestine in the first century. However, Jesus points out that the amount she gives is not the point. Instead, this poor widow gave everything she had out of generosity and her love for God. Now, an interesting side note to this story is when I visited Israel several years ago. A small jewelry store was selling a widow's mite as a necklace set in gold. I had to wonder that day if they had missed the point of the story. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.